I don't know if it's me, I don't think it is, but over the last few years, and increasingly so as the months have passed, it seemed to me that more and more people in authority, in local councils, in even things like the health service in Britain, medical hospitals, etc., and in the whole kind of spectrum of authority, people in those positions are increasingly becoming robotic. You can feel more and more this us and them division, where more and more of them see themselves as somehow above everyone else. And you find this a lot with people when they talk about the police, where they will say that, you know, police, they used to be servants to the community, they used to serve the community. Now it's kind of us and them. It's like they're at war with the community. All this sort of stuff. And, of course, authority has always had what we call in Britain jobs worth people. More than my job's worth, mate, not to do this to the letter of the law and all the rest of it. But it seems to me, and I've been observing this for quite a time now, that those kind of people are getting more and more prevalent. And more that mentality is getting control of the institutions that dictate to society, dictate to people. And there is clearly some kind of coordinated attempt here to put that kind of mentality in those positions. Now, on one level, of course, you can say that, well, you just decide that that's the kind of people you're going to recruit, and then over a period of time, as people leave or are not of that mentality, you fill that position with someone who is, and the whole thing builds up. Now, that is part of it, there's no question. But it seems to me to be more than that, in the scale and the speed with which it's happening. And also, of course, if you can put positions of the top authority, those positions that have the right to appoint people to an organisation who decides who's employed and who isn't, if you can put those positions in the hands of those who are working for you, then of course this whole process of filling the institutions with people of that ilk becomes faster and faster. But even again, it's more than that. And I began to understand more about the more than that when I started to look into these organizations that I guess you could bring them under the heading of training organizations, training programs. More and more, people in authority and people who work for the institutions are sent off to training programs to be leaders, or diversity programs to be politically correct, and all this stuff. And it's getting more and more prevalent. I've talked to people in some of these organizations and they're frankly sick of it. And this element of it, this training program explosion, is a key part of this operation to completely hijack the institutions of authority with those that think and see the world in a certain way. Which brings me to an organisation which started in Britain, now operates in Europe, and increasingly is moving in on America, and North America, I understand. And it's called Common Purpose. Now that's a wonderful name, really, because it seems to have a common purpose, and that common purpose is to have a common mentality throughout these institutions in terms of those who are in leadership positions. In my last book, I talked a bit about common purpose, and there's a quote in here from one of its own publications in which it talks about what it claims to stand for. And it says this: common purpose aims to improve the way society works by expanding the vision, decision-making ability and influence of all kinds of leaders. The organisation runs a variety of educational programs for leaders of all ages, backgrounds and sectors. in order to provide them with the inspiration, information and opportunities they need to change the world. Change the world, but change the world into what and to what end? There's a man called Brian Gerrish. He's a former naval officer who began through his own experience of common purpose to look into this, and now he's the premier investigator into this organisation. And as you would expect, it starts to connect out into a stream of organisations through personnel interlocks and what have you, to the organisations that I've been exposing and naming in my books for, best part of 15, 20 years. And the way that it talks, the way that it describes itself, the way that it kind of operates, gives me a real feel of an organisation, again, that has been exposed in my books all these years, called the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Now, the Tavistock Institute, which was brought into being in the 1940s, just after the war, that kind of time, is one, if not the, world's premier mass mind control operation in terms of coming up with the techniques that can get lots of people, groups, bigger groups, the population as a whole, to see the world and what passes for think the same. So all this subject of common purpose and its interconnections, and as it's now expanding into the wider world, has caused me to focus on it quite a lot in recent times. And I met with Brian Gerrish recently on a wet and windy day, but the weather didn't matter because the information was very, very interesting to me. And I recorded an interview with him for about half an hour or so, which you can see now. And then also with this video cast, there's a longer presentation by Brian in which he brings in lots more information. So anyway, let's start off by listening to the chat that I had with Brian Gerrish recently about common purpose and what was its purpose. And I started by asking him first how he became aware of this organisation.
Well, with a colleague, we were trying to set up a project in Plymouth, which was to help people in the local community. It was skills training connected with the building of small wooden boats. So it was to help people who've been long-term unemployed, basically. And the project was starting to get some real attention, and it had a lot of support from the community people. And we were looking to develop it into something quite big. And it was like overnight, the establishment stopped speaking to us. So the City Council, the Government Office of the Southwest, the Southwest Regional Development Agency and others who had been talking to us stopped talking. It was quite bizarre, and when we started to sort of research to find out what had gone on, we were led to an organisation called Common Purpose, which we'd never heard of before, but we started to discover that literally hundreds of people in the city were involved with. So it was a strange experience.
And what did you find out initially about Common Purpose?
Well, we discovered that there was a charity which said that it was training future leaders. But the strange thing was that people who were involved in it, in this charity, connected with it, were not talking about it. So it seemed from the outset rather secretive. And in fact, we had to do quite a lot of research to identify just who was connected with it. And we found this puzzling because you would have thought that if you'd done a wonderful course with a wonderful charity, you'd sort of be telling everybody about it. But it seemed that people preferred to just keep rather quiet about it.
What's its history?
Well, from what we've established to date, if I just stick with the official version is that it was started in about 1985 by a lady called Julia Middleton. She says that she'd seen similar organisations running in America. She wanted to start one here. She raised £500,000 in a very short space of time, and the next minute, having started, I believe, in an office behind the body shop in Oxford Street, or at the back of Oxford Street, she was then starting small common purpose units across the country. And in their own words, they now say that they've trained over 30,000 leaders and probably affected the lives of about 80,000 other people.
And they're also moving into other countries, aren't they, America included?
Absolutely, but it's been quite interesting to watch. They seem to have focused on Britain, certainly from the time Julia Middleton's been pushing it. It initially got established in Britain, over in Northern Ireland, and then they seemed to move into Europe, into Germany and Holland, and from there it's sort of spread to the Commonwealth countries, so into South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. So there appears to be a pattern to the way it's been developed and expanded.
I know you've done years of research on this, and there are many other people working with you now. From what you've gathered, what is its purpose? What is common purpose really about? What's it trying to achieve?
Well, I believe it's very clear. They want to create people who they regard as the new leaders, and these people are designed to lead society. The training talks about bringing people together from all walks of life to learn about each other and their professions and how they do things. But ultimately, common purpose is very clear on one line, which is to create the future leaders who will change people's perceptions of their society. So common purpose, I believe, is designed to create leaders who will change our society.
Well, how are they doing that? How are they affecting people so that they think in the desired fashion?
Well, from observing people and talking to people, what is happening is that they're putting teams of people together, say 12, 20 people, and they are discussing a number of issues, they're introducing issues, and in that discussion and interaction, we believe they're using a group psychology which is designed to change the way people think, and ultimately, if you've done that, you change the way they behave.
What sort of techniques are they using to affect the way people see themselves and their jobs?
Well, if you take it at a simple level, one of the things that they continually talk about is allowing people to operate outside their authority. So they'll describe that a person, say a police officer, does his or her job, and he stays working within a silo, a pipeline, and that means that he doesn't see how a school teacher or a nurse or a dentist works. And common purpose believes that by opening up the debate, people can see how to operate outside their immediate authority. Now, the danger with this is, on one hand, it appears a very laudable thing, but when you analyse it, you have to ask some questions, which is it a good thing that a policeman starts to get involved in issues which are not part of his police duties? So if I end up with a policeman who is in a meeting, particularly if it's behind closed doors, with a selection of other people who are involved in developments or regeneration work, is that a good thing that the policeman is operating outside his authority? So it's, on one hand, it appears very simple that by putting people of different experience together, they can share that experience. But we know, because common purpose is also admitting it, that their training is based on the work of ultimately Jung and other psychologists who are clearly people who have looked at how you change people's belief by modifying their behaviour, behavioural-based training.
I must say, I've been saying for quite a time now that I've noticed that we've always had a certain mentality within authority, what we know in Britain as job's worth. It's more than my job's worth, mate, not to stick to the rules and everything. But it has been my observation for some time now that people in authority, people in uniform, people in government, etc., administrative level, have taken on this unthinking rigidity of almost robotic-like response to situations that is on a much greater scale than I've ever noticed before. Are we talking about the same sort of thing that you think Common Purpose wants to bring about?
Well, I think we are. I'm certain that we are, because what you're seeing Common Purpose do is bring people into a common line, a common manner of thought. And it is quite well known, if you bring a group of people together and you start to discuss ideas, that in general most people will go with a common view. They don't want to be identified as a maverick or somebody who's got way out ideas. So common purpose training automatically brings people to a common view, and that common view is about how society should be, in their opinion, and then you're being trained in order to be a leader to take society in that direction. But something I would say, and we've learned a lot more about this over the last couple of years, is that common purpose is just one vehicle by which this common mind is being created. We can call it a Rolls Royce. It's a particularly powerful, particularly effective one. But there are other vehicles which are being used to drive people into this common way of thinking. And those courses can be leadership courses, they can be stress management courses, they can even be diversity courses. So they can have very innocuous or nice sounding names, but ultimately when people are involved in them, those courses are designed to take away maverick or dissenting views and bring people to whatever the approved common line is. And I think you can see this when people are interviewed on the TV, for example, that you can swap between politicians, but they give you the same sort of sound bites.
You gave me an example when we were chatting earlier of a diversity course or diversity training where someone had a view when they went in and a different view when they came out. Could you describe that for people?
Yeah, well, this was brought to my attention by a lady who'd been with a police officer for 17 years as a partner, and one day he'd come home from work saying that he'd been on a diversity training course, and she asked him what that was about, and he didn't seem to tell her a lot about it. Now, she didn't think much about that until a couple of weeks later when they went out for a drink with another police officer who was a friend, who happened to be a coloured officer, and he brought up the subject of the diversity course. And what he said was really quite interesting, because he said that if he hadn't realised that he was black before he did the course, he realised it after the course. And what he described is being asked a series of questions where it was trying to get him to actually respond, to say that events that had happened to him were directly as a result of his colour, as opposed to the fact that, he's performing as a normal, ordinary policeman. So they were asking if an event happened at the end of a shift, do you think that's because you're coloured? To which he said no, because that happened to all the other officers. So then they gave him another question, do you think that happened because you're coloured? Well, it's possible. And eventually the question comes in, do you think that's because you're coloured? To which he says, well, you could be right. Now what they'd actually done is taken him through a series of questions where they'd taken a man who had no problems or issues with his colour or the behaviour of other colleagues, and they'd started to put seeds in his mind that perhaps there was a problem. Now this story, I believe, was, I know it is a true story, I know that for certain, but I think it's so important because not only was the coloured officer affected, but the lady's partner, she observed him change, and she described a partner she'd known for, I think, for nearly 17 years, become very brutish and start to talk about us, the police, versus them out there, the public, the troublemakers. And eventually his change in behaviour and demeanour was such that she got to the point where she had to leave him. Now, we've heard a lot about these types of changes in people after they've gone on courses. We've heard it about people who've done common purpose training. We've heard it about people who've done stress management courses. And this one was very interesting for us because it was on the theme of diversity. And what we are certain is going on is that people, particularly in the public sector, are being cycled through courses which may have one name, but actually they're being used to change the people's viewpoint. There's another example of this where I believe it was a fire station up in Scotland where fire officers refused to hand out leaflets at a gay conference, a seminar, and they were censured by the senior fire officer. And what ultimately happened to them is that they had to attend a diversity training course. Now, there was obviously a purpose to that course, and that course was effectively to say that their beliefs were wrong or their values were wrong. Now, I'm not arguing about whether it's right or wrong to be gay. What I'm talking about is the fact that you're being given a course to change your value. And if I just one last point on this, because I think it's an important one. People working within the public sector have reported to us that they're seeing more and more cases where people are having to do courses, leadership courses, management courses. Those are compulsory courses if they want to be promoted, if they are to be appointed into a more senior post. And I believe that there is effectively a malevolent driving force behind these courses. You are putting people through courses where you can control the way they think and behave.
We're talking mind control, put it in simple terms.
We are talking mind control. And although a lot of people, if you mention that sort of word or you mention brainwashing, they think, oh, this can't possibly be true. It is so easy to do these things, whether you are using a group psychology or neuro-linguistic programming. There are a variety of techniques by which you can change people's behaviour.
I find it interesting where you talk about the case of the policeman developing from what was not there before, an us versus the public mentality, when if you spoke to enormous numbers of people in Britain about the public relationship with the police, they complained that that's what it's become. Like, instead of the police serving the community, they are almost at war with it.
Yeah, well, this is a taught technique in my view, and I believe there is a growing base of evidence for this. This is not one or two policemen who are changing in their attitudes. You are seeing a large number of police officers changing their whole demeanour, and the only place that can come from is the training courses which they're doing.
Now, another area of concern is the way that common purpose are moving in on schools, and you were telling me the British government has now recognised common purpose as an agency that should be allowed into schools.
Well, an approved training organisation. There were 3 approved at the same time, a little bit over a year ago. I can't remember the third one, but the second one I think is very significant because it was the Tavistock Institute. And if you've done any research in this field at all, you will know that the Tavistock Clinic is the home of behavioural modification. So I don't believe it's an accident that an organisation like Tavistock is now being put directly alongside young children.
I've been writing about Tavistock for a long, long time, and when I did read some of the common purpose literature, I did describe it as like something straight out of Tavistock. There seems to be a very obvious connection, certainly for me, between the way the two organisations operate.
Yeah. Well, I personally believe, and again I think the evidence is there to support it, that common purpose type activity in America was actually then picked up and brought back to UK, and Julia Middleton then got involved. But I believe that the seat of that activity was Tavistock, so that the original behavioural modification techniques were developed in Tavistock. I believe that they were trialled in the late 60s and early 70s at Oxford University, and then they were exported across to America. So basically, after the American trial period, they were re-imported back into UK. That's where I believe it's come from.
So what's happening in relation to common purpose in schools now then?
Well, one of the key things is that when we initially started to get interested in what they're doing, going back to about 2002, most of their programmes were targeting children of the age of 13, 14. But certainly over the last 2-3 years, we're now seeing common purpose starting to target children from the age of sort of about 7, 8. And I think this again is very significant, because we know that the younger you catch a child and start to work on their values and beliefs, the easier they are to manipulate.
So you talk about targeting children. What techniques do they use when they go into schools then?
Well, it can be mixed now, because you can have courses that are simply being run to teach children about society. They are very innocuous, or they sound innocuous. We're going to teach you about your town and how it works. How do new buildings get there? So you get in and you're dealing with a child who yet hasn't developed their own personality. They're doing some basic reading and writing and sums, and you've got somebody now starting to talk about the power structures of cities, or you're starting to get children to do conflict resolution courses. That's been reported in the paper recently. So young children, very young children, are being taught how to act as an interface where there's a dispute between two other children. Now, these are quite sophisticated concepts, and I question why these sorts of things are being introduced to young children.
Have you come across evidence in all this research of children's personalities changing as a result of some of this stuff?
Well, I can say yes, and the area that we are most concerned about, there's two key ones. One is circle time, which is where children in schools are at a particular point in the day are brought together in a circle. There'll be a teacher with them, and in some cases there can be a social worker with them, and the children are encouraged to tell the other people in the circle about personal things that have happened to them. So they could be events at home, or they could be a holiday. But what you're starting to do is break down the child's natural barriers to revealing personal information about themselves. And it's a fact that when we are born, from the very earliest time our personality is forming, we have an instinctive knowledge of what is personal information and what is to be shared with other people. And what circle time does is start to break those barriers down. And so children will reveal secrets which can be used against them, or they will reveal things about their parents which really should not be shared with strangers. And we know that some teachers who are watching this happen at the moment are getting very, very concerned, because with a social worker standing on hand as well, you can see the situation where a young child could give its version of an event at home, which could then be translated by the social worker into something far more sinister. As a semi-light-hearted example, you could say that the child saw daddy hurting mummy, when in fact what they saw is the parents making love. They shouldn't have seen that. But that, introduced in circle time, could mean that there's a visit to the house to see whether the father was assaulting the mother.
And because the government has approved common purpose, it's more difficult for schools to reject them and not let them come in.
What is now happening is that you're blurring the boundaries by what is a set-piece curriculum, where the Board of Governors and the teachers are well aware of what they're teaching and why. You've now got a number of authorities organisations coming in where the teaching staff and even the governors won't be too sure whether they're official or non-official. Common Purpose is a charity, and yet it's acting as though it was a government body, and this blurring of the boundaries, operating outside authority, as Common Purpose would say, has some very dangerous precedents. If I may, the other thing which is at the back of my mind is we're also seeing techniques called creative visualisation being used in schools. We have a key example where in Leeds education area, school teachers were given a course in creative visualisation, and during those courses, some of the teachers, ladies, experienced very dark, frightening images in their minds which they couldn't shake off. And what they pointed out is if this technique could give them nightmares effectively, although they saw the images during the day, then what effect was it going to have on the mind of a 5 or 6 year old? And they raised complaints, and those complaints were never acted upon. But the research we did, and I can back this up with documentary evidence, was that the gentleman running those creative visualisation courses had no formal qualifications in any form of psychology or psychiatry or hypnotism. He simply had a combined degree in psychology and geology, and at the time he undertook the courses with the teachers, he didn't even have a signed contract, so presumably he gave that training totally uninsured. So I just wonder whether what we're actually starting to see is a very dark side of the government get into schools in order to attempt to program or change children's behaviour from the earliest possible age.
I was going to ask you, what point have we reached in terms of the scale of common purpose graduates, I think they call them, or common purpose trained people, actually in the institutions of power?
Well, they're riddles. The whole of the institutions are riddles, whether it's the police or the education system or the NHS. By the people that we've already identified, we're talking over 30,000 people. So divide that up by the number of large cities, pick a figure, 15, and you're talking with the whole of the establishment riddled with common purpose people.
And this connects into the European Union, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It connects into the European Union not only because you can easily see from Common Purpose's website that they have been running courses in other European countries, but we're also seeing material, and what I'm talking about is evidence-based. I'm not talking about guesswork, I'm talking documents. We can see Common Purpose saying that it's very important that they increase the linking of graduates in UK with those in Europe. Quote, our networks will soon become very important. And the reason for this is it will be the Common Purpose trained leaders who are going to run the new society, and they are starting to do so.
So this just some of the background, the themes of the background to Common Purpose. And in other countries there will be organisations just like this with different names, but the modus operandi will be just the same. And also with this videocast, as I mentioned, is a longer presentation by Brian Gerrish about Common Purpose and its connections, and also ways that those in Britain, and if Common Purpose is operating in your country, other countries too, can help by approaching the authorities in their area and finding out if there are any Common Purpose training programs being funded by the local council, the local police, whatever, to train their personnel as Common Purpose leaders. And Brian Gerrish is building up with his group a lot of information about the scale of Common Purpose in its infiltration of the institutions. And they are finding that the numbers as they move on are getting very considerable indeed, and they've only just started really compared with where they want to go. So look for that on this videocast email, because it's a great way of helping Brian Gerrish and this group to gather the information necessary to continue with their campaign of exposure and of questioning. Okay, that's it, and I'll see you next week.